Good time of the day for everybody who's watching this webinar. I am Angelika Rutsunova, and among other things that I do in life, I am a co-founder of the recently established Dalan Fund, which for the previous 15 months was known as CEECCNA Collaborative Fund. We established this fund after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and the funder's unprecedented interest in responding to that crisis. Activists in and from the region recognized that there is a need for the movement-led mechanism to expand funders' understanding about this part of the world and prepare for more future crises that are coming to the region, which we were very much aware there will be more coming to the region, as well as to have a mechanism that can be led by the activists in and from the region to distribute resources there. So it's not about the money coming to us from outside only and being decided outside of the regions. So I'm very, very happy to be doing this work around the fund and as well as with the people who are on this call. Consider this is your under 1 hour crash course about the complex context and intersectional organizing across Central Eastern Europe, Caucasus, Central and North Asia. And this is by far not an exhaustive and all-encompassing conversation, because how could it be? There are over 20 countries in what we call Central Eastern Europe, Caucasus, Central and North Asia. These are several regions, not one. With distinct cultures, histories, multiple languages, and peoples living within each of these territories. These regions are home to 4 fully closed authoritarian regimes, not something that we are very proud of as a fact, but it is a fact, unfortunately. It currently has 2 open conflicts and multiple frozen and protracted conflicts, as well as disputed territories all across the regions. It has a continuous attacks on human rights, freedoms of speech, and rights to assembly and organizing, and so much more, which we will hear about in this webinar. This webinar should be viewed as welcome to the region packet as part of it. And this is what you need to know before you land in the regions of this part of the world. We invite you to take in what is useful from this incredible activists who are joining me today and continue learning from this beyond this 1 hour conversation. So without further disclaimers, I want to introduce to you the remarkable people who I'm joined with. They will do more detailed introductions about themselves, but you will see that I have Tanta Mikeladze from Georgia, a founder of the Social Justice Center in Georgia, Anastasia Danilova, Advocacy and Community Engagement Manager with Euro-Central Asian Lesbian Community, Nick Antipov, who is a human rights activist, a co-founder and project manager at Makeout, as well as Nurjan Estebis, who is a resource distribution coordinator at Dalan Fund, my colleague, and an activist and a researcher from Kyrgyzstan. Welcome, everyone. So let's dive in. So if you could each do a little bit of the introduction of who you are, how you are joining and lending in this conversation, and considering that this is kind of a welcome to the region's crash course, what are some of the most important historical and current trends and realities that you think is important for anybody who's coming to these regions, to this part of the world, that they should know? And if I could start with you, Anastasia, please.
Thank you so much, Angelika, for introduction and also for invitation to this very important discussion. So I'm based in Moldova, and I'm in LGBT activism and an LGBT movement in Moldova for almost 20 years. I used to work at the human rights LGBT organization Gender.m for 17 years, and 13 of them I was executive director of the organization. Now I work at the Euro-Central Asian Lesbian Community, and I have a broader vision to the region. And of course, also during my activism in Moldova, I was able to build a lot of relationships and to meet with many activists from all over Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Caucasus, so in our region. And I think this discussion is very important because unfortunately, very often our region is seen from outside as one country. And we called post-Soviet space very, very often. And I think it's really important to remind that Soviet Union was collapsed many, many years ago. And of course, due to being part of Soviet Union, we have a lot of common historical background. And we have some similarities in our basic legislation. But at the same time, now we are separate countries and each country has its own way of development. And when we speak about region, we need to understand that it's really important to find this balance between us being one part of the world and having some historical common background, but at the same time to be separate countries with their own languages, with their own view of future for the country and recent developments. And I think what we have in common is, first of all, the legislative situation very often is far away from a real life of our communities. Sometimes our countries adopt laws and adopt some legislations for better image of the country at international level. But due to lack of time, capacities, financial support, or political will, those legislations are not fully implemented. And the real life of our communities are still very, very hard, even in such progressive countries as Moldova, where I come from. Another very important point is geopolitical situation greatly influence our advocacy work. And in this situation, what is acceptable and what works in some countries couldn't be unrealistic in other countries. And it's also very important to see because not because activists do not try harder or not because so sometimes just all our efforts are run into the wall of geographical interests and huge players in the region. And sometimes it's just impossible to resist. And yeah, and as I mentioned, the main issue in the region and how it's perceived from outside, we cannot be considered as a single one. So we are very, very diverse, and there are a lot of nuances, and this affects absolutely everything, including work with our communities. And sometimes stakeholders came to us and they tried to teach us how to build communities, how to work with communities. And they bring us good practices and good examples from even our neighbor countries. But what works in some countries couldn't be applied in other countries. And also, what is important to mention that all positive changes we achieved working very, very hard and during a long period of time, they unfortunately are under constant risk. And again, due to geopolitical situation, everything could roll back very quickly. And we have such examples in the region, unfortunately. I think I will stop here to give floor to my colleagues to add their opinion on the issue.
Thanks a lot, Anastasia. I really appreciate you setting the broader context. Nurjan, I would like to move to you. Building on what Anastasia shared, I was especially struck by the point that you made, Anastasia, around the governments adopting legislations that are good for their image outside of the country. I'm thinking about most recent legislation Kyrgyzstan just adopted. I'm sure it's probably good for their image in some countries that are also adopting those restrictive laws, but not so good for the image in others. Could you give us a little bit more of like a context of Kyrgyzstan and wider Central Asia as well, to build up on differences and similarities? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Nurcan Estebes. I am from and I'm based in Kyrgyzstan, Bishkek. My background is I've been working for years for various human rights and women's rights organizations, doing community building, conducting researches on human rights and women's rights violations and issues, and also recently worked on a regional level for climate network as well. If we speak about broadly about Central Asia, Central Asia is very diverse. I will be mostly speaking from Kyrgyzstan perspective, as I am from and based here, and maybe just giving some glimpses to Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, as I have a network and colleagues from there, but less connection with Turkmenistan, for example. So, and what is shown in media about our countries might not be true all the time, which is also very much controlled by the governments due to restrictive control of media, journalism, so regarding Kyrgyzstan's perspective, it's like very recent news. It's the adoption of the foreign agents law. It's the copy paste of the Russian law, just, you know, with the different naming, foreign representatives. And then the criminal liability was lifted, but still, if NGOs they won't, proclaim again themselves as a foreign representative, that they would be fined and they would get, let's say, liquidated. I think this word was introduced way before in some of the countries. So this would also, these are the particular, let's say, consequences that would Kyrgyzstan civil society face. But in terms of, if we speak about the tendency and the long situation, the pressure on civil society and restriction of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly has been long before, and it started already in 2024. It's just, you know, now the law has been introduced, but the pressure on the activists and imprisonment and detention of journalists has been practiced for way more than it seems right now. So it's like, it's not the peak of the crisis. Crisis have started long before that. And one of the, I want to also very quickly glimpse on the, what was the reasoning behind and how we didn't have a big, huge protests like one Georgia had. And for example, in Kyrgyzstan, if we speak about Kyrgyzstan, yeah, because of the, already when we have this new political regime, they restricted the right to protest, and anyone who attempted to protest, even, you know, like for the issue like air pollution, they would be detained or they would be fined. So, and then for bigger issues, not saying that one issues are bigger or smaller, but like for political issues, people would get like really afraid to protest because of the detention. And the reasoning behind what the legislators have been saying is that one of the reasons is the security reasons. And this is a very much it's a very important point for Kyrgyz society, and I feel like for Central Asian society overall, like security, and because there is a narrative that we are, everywhere. So it's like Russia is only one ally, and there are threats from everywhere. And then this law and the introduction of like having and knowing which people and which organizations are funded from foreign, let's say, powers, they say, from foreign agencies, are then like government introduced it as a security precaution as well. And for many people, it makes sense because of the history of being pretty much oppressed under Soviet time, before that, ethnic cleansing, and participating in World War II. So this, let's say, trauma, generational trauma on like losing, your nation, losing your people, and it influenced a lot. And still, if you talk to the like older generation and even younger generation, so like if you put the argument of security reasons, then people would just agree and accept it, and be afraid to resist for that reasons as well. Another, I wanted to also, maybe I could touch a bit later, the issues of how the tendency of being dependent in many ways from Russia is strengthening after a full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine. For example, energy dependence of Central Asia, as Russia now is planning to build nuclear power plants in Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, and also, like renew uranium mining, which was, for example, lifted in Kyrgyzstan in 2019. It was banned. And we have a very painful history of Soviet Union extractivist, policy regarding environmental and environmental politics towards Central Asia. And now it's like happening all over again. And local activists have been resisting it, but there is not like enough capacity, and a lot of issues are against them. Let's say a lot of powers against them. So I would stop here, and maybe I could develop more later on the other questions.
Thanks, Nurjan. This is really important pieces of context. Maybe I'll just add one, because I'm also from Uzbekistan. On the last point that you were talking about, the long history of the, Russian dependency on Russia, but also Russia using the lands of Central Asia for energy, for farms. During Soviet times, Central Asia has been like a farm of the rest of the Soviet Union, with a lot of extractive ways of raising crops. So in Uzbekistan, for example, the cotton has been introduced during the very beginning of Soviet Union. That has been completely devastating for environment of Uzbekistan. It has depleted all of the rivers. It has completely depleted the Aral Sea, has created absolute environmental disaster that caused a lot of health harms as well for people of Kyrgyzstan who live around the Aral Sea. And some of that history is not necessarily widely known as well, but we have a long history of being kind of extracted by the Russian and Soviet regimes. And yes, I know we will build up a little bit more on that later in the conversation, but I just wanted to add. And I want to make one more disclaimer to your early introduction that you don't have as many connections in Turkmenistan. I also want to say it's not only because of you, or not necessarily because you personally don't have connections, but because Turkmenistan is our own North Korea. It is one of the success cases of the authoritarian closed regimes that a lot of nobody can come in, nobody can come out. And all of the organizing, if happening at all, around Turkmenistan is mostly happening outside of it. And that's another reality that I think would be important for people who are, learning about the region, to understand that many of us are actually diasporic organizers. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later as well. But Tamta, I wanted to shift to you. And, comparatively to Kyrgyzstan, Georgia has a long history of public protest. And just yesterday, there was a lot of protests as well around another legislation, or 3 different type of restrictive legislations that are happening in Kyrgyzstan. Could you please let us know about what's happening in Georgia currently? What are some of the historic background that is important to know? And what is some of the narrative journey that you want to share from your perspective?
Well, thank you for this opportunity to share with you our findings and observations we have regarding our region. I'm Tamta Mikeladze, representing Social Justice Center, Tbilisi-based leftist feminist organization, which is actively working on different issues related to the human rights protection and social justice. We are trying to be with the different activist groups, social movements, and support their struggles and their work for the just and solidary society. So maybe I will start from like the more historical background, and then I will move regarding the current development and some shifts we are observing in the Georgian politics. When we are talking about the important events or tendencies in our region, maybe broadly, even broadly in Caucasus region, I would like to highlight several important events. First of all, of course, it's the high risks of war, which is connected with the ambitions of imperial or authoritarian political systems in our neighborhood. At the war in Chechnya, one in Georgia in 2008, one in Ukraine now, and also somehow the war in Arabah is the example of this. These imperial influences often make it difficult for the states on the Russia's periphery to have real sovereignty and independency and to really develop their foreign policy as they see. And unfortunately, the alternative security and economic development mechanism, which is proposed by the Western partners, remain weak and cautious. And now, especially after the war in Ukraine, we are more actively speaking about the importance of alternative security and economic support from the side of the EU, NATO, etc. Russian imperialism today refers to Russia's pursuit of political, economic, and strategic influence beyond its border, very often through assertive or coercive instruments. And this can take various forms, including territorial expansion, war, economic dominance, or the protection of the military power, etc. And Georgian case is like very typical because we had the war with Russia in 90s, in 28. We are under the economic dominance of the Russia, and also, unfortunately, our country became the place of this soft war coming from Russia, this propaganda which is very aggressively coming from the north. The second point I would like to highlight, it's about the power dynamics and how the building of the new states happened in our region after the collapse of Soviet Union. Yeah. Because when we are talking about the 90s, it's not only the collapse of the Soviet Union as a political system, but also the collapse of economical system, and we see the new distribution, like the new dynamics of redistribution of the resources in our countries when the groups who had the political power or some violent criminal power, how they distributed resources at that time, and finally how they became our political leaders. Yeah. So I think that this period, how these new countries after the Soviet Union were established, this time is like very crucial to understanding what kind of challenges these political systems have. And we see how the politics and capital is intervening to each other, yeah, which make very difficult to producing the real democratic politics in our countries and in region, and how the money and oligarchs are influencing on daily life of our people. We see that it's like the somehow common in post-Soviet countries. The third tendency, like some specificity I'm observing in our region, and especially in those countries who had so-called the Will Revolution, which of course were very important political events due to the modern state, to construct the independent institutions. But on the other hand, these revolutions have a specific ideological framework. It's like the neoliberal economy and the politics. And we see how the revolution, for example, in Georgia, our country became the place of aggressive neoliberal experiments, aggressive modernization and marketization with the very problematic repressive means. And finally, we found how the poverty and economic inequality increased in our country, and also somehow how dissatisfaction with the democratization processes, this Europeization processes emerge in our country, because somehow all this dissatisfaction we had regarding the results of revolution is considered as a problem of the Europeization trajectory in our country. And that's why we see now how the anti-European forces are trying to use these grievances and these satisfactions effectively in their propaganda. And lastly, the fourth argument or layer of my argumentation, it's about the exclusionist form of nationalism that exclude various groups, including non-dominant religious and ethnic groups, women, LGBTI people from the politics, from the public space, from the logic of distribution of the rights, power, and resources. And you know that even all these countries, including Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, our nationalisms had quite problematic nature. It's quite aggressive, ethno-religious nationalists, and it's hinders cohesion of our societies and the building of the equal and solidar society. And you know that finally these nationalisms somehow created the conflicts within our societies, ethnopolitical conflicts, and the results of these conflicts are damaging the real politics even now. And we see how effectively the different elites and even the Russia is trying to instrumentalize our traumas and war-related fears even now. So this is like the main historical, like the structural issues, which is directly influencing on the politics of Georgia. But especially after the war in Ukraine, we are observing very very sudden and very quick shifts in Georgian politics, and somehow even it's very difficult to follow and explain. And usually we are giving to each other a lot of questions what is happening in our country in reality, because you know that Georgia has this informal oligarch, like the oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili, who made his capital and money in Russia, and now he's like the informal ruler of this country. And even the procedure, like the processes in our politics is quite hidden and out of the control of the democratic procedures, out of the institutional frameworks, etc. And we see that Georgian government is changing the foreign policy from normative foreign policy towards pragmatic, multi-vectoral foreign policy. They started the softening of relationship with Russia, strategic cooperation with China, and this shift is directly influencing on the domestic policy of Georgia. In light of these dynamics, we see that Georgian government started introduction of so-called Russian law against the LGBTI people, against the civil society organizations, restricting their work, their rights, blaming us as a foreign agents, which is the way to demoralize and discreditate civil society, which is quite vibrant, active, and trustful in our society. So yeah, now we are struggling with these new tendencies in Georgian politics to protect the European aspiration of this country, to effectively use this chance to integrate within the EU, which emerged after the war in Ukraine. And of course, we are trying to avoid the democratization of this country. And unfortunately, we see that the democratic tendencies is also very, very active in our country.
Thanks so much, Shanta. This is super comprehensive, and I'm sure that whoever's watching this webinar will need to rewatch some of this several times because there's just so many things packed in this, and it's very complex. So I really appreciate you all nuancing and building up on one another as well. Nick, I want to come to you with your perspective on this very first question around, the historic and the current situation. We started from Anastasia in the Central East Europe, went to Central Asia, Caucasus, and then could you package for us from where you are positioned? What is your perspective on what has been happening and what is happening currently? And introduce yourself as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelica. And it's always a pleasure to be when I'm in the room with the activist, queer and feminist activists from our region. I always feel like home. So and I also was while I was listening to all of you, I also like feeling it's the same situation, the same trauma. So my name is Nick Antipov. I was born in Minsk, Belarus, and 20 years old. I started after when I came out to my parents. I decided that I wanted to influence to do something with LGBTQ plus activism because at that time I believed that I could change my city, I could create community, I could create. And basically, I wanted to change my country, which at that time I was thinking that our society we were leaning more towards European values, European democracy. But basically I was, with my teammates, we made a beautiful anti-discrimination project, Make Out, which unfortunately right now is dissolved after it's due to repercussions of the 2020 rigged elections, presidential election in Belarus, when the regime decided to target the civic society more broadly. Now we have a sphere where it's I would say NGO-free zone in Belarus, because more than 900 organizations right now wiped out, more than 500,000 Belarusians right now in exile. It's not only, and this is my story as well. I'm one of them. I started my new life in Berlin in 2021. So, but despite that fact that I lost the meaning of life, the meaning of my, the meaning of what I thought we could do. I've tried to still do something, to still find a way how can I intervene to my country, and how can I still influence to my country. So this is why I decided to do a media project about gender and sexuality, more working in TikTok and Instagram. So trying to create as a safer space for LGBTQ plus people, and mostly and trying to influence to the younger generation in Belarus, and try to them to change their perspective and towards more support for LGBTQ plus people and values and rights. So basically, I don't want to repeat my colleagues. I also feel that we have the common trauma, this trauma of Soviets, of Russian Empire. My grandfathers were raskulacheny. It means that they also was like the Soviets and Reds. They took all their wealth. So when we started with nothing. So, and I also feel like myself, like at my grandfather's right now in Berlin, I also feel myself, I'm starting from nothing, but I'm like 30 years old right now. So we also have this tendency from in our countries which lean more towards authoritarianism, and this is also, I feel that we have something in common which we can unite together. And we also have our people from our countries have this longing for democracy, longing for freedom, which is what is this. But so after talking about historical and talking about like current contexts in my region, that's simple. My region is on fire since 2020, when the protests in Belarus began. And since then, Belarus has experienced significant political repressions. It's still ongoing. It's still people like every day we're receiving new evidence and new news that some new people right now in jail. In the government, the government created like a vacuum for the activism. So a lot of people like left Belarus. So we have this like we have this feeling like nothing is going on in Belarus. We also have this we have war. And when I'm saying war, that I wanted to also to acknowledge that Belarus is reportedly preparing for war. So from the last interviews from our dictator Lukashenko and from the Minister of Defense, we are preparing for war, aligning closely with Russia. And this preparation comes amidst the backdrop of hosting Russian military forces, and including nuclear missiles, which never happened before. We changed constitution to do it, and now we are hosting nuclear weapons in our country. So we see this escalating, and I also see this escalating of war. I see that sometimes I feel that it's the Belarusians and our regions like a very hopeless situation, because it's like what we can do anything else. It's like nothing. There is no. So we just can only survive. And people in Belarus, they just also feel they wanted to survive despite all these ordeals. Yeah, and at the same time, as my colleagues also mentioned, we are also Belarus also trying to counter European values and make a clear divide between the West and East. So we are also plan to adapt very strict anti-LGBTQ+ law, which prohibit any information about positive information about LGBTQ+, about surgery reassignment, sex reassignment surgery, and also about they also decided to show like divide between regarding like feminist optics. It's about child-free information. So if you are also child-free and also publishing anything information that you don't want to have a child, you can also be persecuted, not only administratively, but also criminally. So you can be just in jail. So we see this tendency that Belarus now as a puppet regime from Russia. And we also have this, so this is like my common perspective. So very hopeless, very lost. But once I'm here, talking about it, I'm not feeling abandoned. I'm not feeling alone. I also feel our region, and I also believe that we still have to talk about like together how we can unite ourselves, how we can unite our forces, how we can start to play chess, not checkers, how we can start be more proactive instead of reactive, how we can reflect, not to play on this game which authoritarians doing very, very good. So we are just losing our energy and time, playing on this checkers, but we need to be more thinking about strategy. This is what I learned from living in exile, because I'm like stress-free right now, I don't feel that somebody knocking on my door, that I will be beaten by the police or I will be in jail. And this is what common into Belarusians, into all our countries who are still living under these repressive regimes. We need the space where we can think, when we can reflect and we can strategize. And I think we need to do it together. yeah, this is my brief thinking about our situation in our region.
Thank you so much for that, Nick. I really appreciate how candid and vulnerable you are with your share. I'm going from personal to family to collective history and trauma and context. It's all very important, and I love you connecting the dots that all of us are experiencing some similar situations and traumas, and then only in solidarity with each other and in conversation with each other, it feels like we can actually move forward. And this is one of the reasons we also wanted to start the fund that I mentioned earlier that we started, is to create the spaces and to support ourselves, to have our own spaces for our own narrative creation and our own storytelling and building on one another. And I really, really love, I think we should have it as a slogan somewhere, to learn to play chess, not checkers. I think that would be one of the quotes we will use from this webinar for sure. Thank you so much for that. And I want to actually invite you in, Anastasia, because after the round of everyone's comments around the kind of context and history, if you want to add anything specifically on Moldova, because you gave a really beautiful kind of region-wide perspective, but so if, for a couple of minutes, if you want to give a little bit of the context within the country.
Thank you so much. After Nick, it's not so easy to speak about a positive example of Moldova, but I think it's also important to highlight some positivities in our region as well. So, and maybe, as you know, Moldova has one of the most positive situation in the region in regards of LGBT rights, especially in terms of legislation. And again, it's like two different things: have progressive legislation and have a real situation of everyday life of LGBT people in the country. But anyway, I would like to mention that in Moldova we have anti-discrimination law, which protects both ground sexual orientation and gender identity. Freedom of assembly is available for LGBT organizations, freedom of association as well. And talking about solidarity, I think we need to use such positive situations in some of our countries to build this solidarity and networking, because, for example, in Moldova, Eastern European Coalition for LGBT rights is registered because Moldova has one of the most positive, most working legislation for associations. Also, Istanbul Convention is ratified in Moldova, and in the criminal code of the country, we have provisions on hate crimes, which also include sexual orientation and gender identity as grounds of protection. At the same time, in Moldova, we do not have any mechanisms of legal gender recognition, and it's a huge problem for trans people, of course. And we do not have legislation which would protect same-sex couples. And we can feel it, especially now during wartime, when war is ongoing in neighbor country, and we have some couples where one person is Ukrainian LGBT person and another one is Moldovan or Russian. Those people are not able to be protected in Moldova or to live in Moldova together. Talking about all those positive developments, I would like to say that we still have a lot of problems. And also, we had a case when a person from Belarus came to Moldova and asked for asylum. And unfortunately, he was refused. And I think it's also a sign about how on the one hand, we can be so developed and so progressive, but at the same time, when we have a real situation, when person really needs our support, our government didn't do that. And LGBT people in Moldova are still one of the most marginalized and discriminated groups. And despite of all those positive legislations, people still face hate speech and hate crimes. And of course, as in many other countries in our region, LGBT rights is still a huge topic of manipulation by opinion of society, especially during elections, election periods, and LGBT issues constantly come up during elections, local or national, and this topic that is much speculated and manipulated by public opinion. Traditional values and Western values, and we always have to somehow to navigate between those two topics. And Moldova is a European country, and with current government, we have this European course, but at the same time, in our history, we used to have in power a socialist party, which is not socialist at all. Of course, they just use the name, but in reality, it's a very homophobic, sexist, conservative party. And they still play a role in political life of the country. And they do not openly support ongoing war in Ukraine, but at the same time, they still highlight that it's important for Moldova to keep good relationships with Russia, and country is still in between. So because we have a huge group of Russian propaganda in the country, we still have regions where people listen and trust to Russian news. And it's a huge machine which has a lot of resources, a lot of influence, a lot of power. And it's very, very hard to be in opposition to this machine and to try to balance somehow all this information. So that's why, unfortunately, Moldovan society is still very divided, because some people, they really don't want Ukrainian war to come to Moldova, and they see European Union as a protective shield. But for other people, they really afraid to lose their own identity, and they think that unity with Russia will keep everything as it used to be, and they're very afraid to change anything in their lives. And in this situation, of course, LGBT issues are very often played as a card by conservative and pro-Russian political parties. So I think that's what I wanted to add super fast.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Anastasia. And this definitely, I start feeling like we need at least 3 to 5 hours crash course, and not an hour that we have for this particular conversation. But I really appreciate each one of you kind of building up more nuances. And it's definitely very, very important for us to understand how different communities are impacted and how different communities within our countries, within our regions, are being used as pawns in the game for some wider gains within the governments. So thank you for giving us that information from Moldova. I want to do a quick round among all of you around specifically what has been the impact of the war in Ukraine on the communities that you are part of, on the countries that you know well. In particular, why I'm interested is when that full-scale invasion by Russia of Ukraine happened in 2022. I already mentioned there was an unprecedented support that started pouring in to respond to that crisis. With that support, it was starting to get very clear to those of us who have been doing resource distribution and resource mobilization for many years, is that there was a very limited understanding of how this invasion is impacting the rest of the countries that are surrounding Ukraine. So let's use this as an opportunity to kind of unpack what has been the impact of that invasion and where we are at right now, 2 years in very succinct, faster manner, if possible. And I'd like to go in a bit of a reverse order. So Nick, if you can start us off. And you already started mentioning some things around the Belarus, of course, and the role of Belarus has been playing in this conflict. So just a bit more nuances on that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, when we're talking about Belarus, also I wanted to differentiate Belarusian government and Belarus. So despite that, I just need to mention after the 2020, when millions marching against the authoritarian, our current regime, when millions marching against the, when all the newspapers around the world were glorified the Belarusians protests, despite that fact, when you have a military, when you have the support from Russia, it's suddenly becomes so easy to stay in the status quo and to somehow to hold these people. And this is also like the I would say this is also the picture for everyone's. And now when Belarusian government, Belarusian like so-called government, you know, like creating like a zone for Russian troops and Russian nuclear missiles in launching rockets towards Ukraine. Yeah, so basically it's so easy to say that Belarus, it's a kind of playing the role. Yeah, our territory playing the role. Yes, the Russian puppets and Lukashenko played the role very, very good. And this is what could happen easily with our countries when Russia decided to intervene. Yeah, so our situation that political activism in Belarus is currently unfeasible, and those within the country are look like that to the country, the people who are inside the country, they are looking to the diaspora for leadership and actions. But democratic forces have largely relocated outside of Belarus. So, and this has created disconnection with the local population. Thanks to the digitalization, thanks to internet, it's sort of like it's a little bit different, but there is a trend of depoliticizations among the diaspora, because it's very hard to keep going and to feel the hope that someday this regime finally fall. And when we're saying some days, we're thinking about 5 or 10 years already. And it's very hard to keep going and to do something. So this is the trend. But the war of in our city, in our country, the war in Ukraine, and what's the biggest trends which concerning me right now, it's the level of nationalism, how it's rising, the level of dehumanization of rising, a hate speech, especially from young men and from boys, especially from our region, who are, I think they are experiencing this crisis of identity. And I'm not talking about like the queer, I'm talking about the what's like the movable middle, these people, which I think the progressive forces certainly right now don't pay attention on this very dangerous, on my opinion, target group, because they are the first one who will be on the Instagram comments and will be starting like putting the hateful comments. They will be first one who on the meeting will, you know, without any hands rising, they will be opposing you. And we are, as a progressive forces, as a forces who are wanted to create a democratic society, we are not engaging with them as much as possible. But the military, the church, the far right, they are using them. They are manipulating them. They are creating this agenda of pride, of like identity. They are answering on these questions. And I'm so afraid that our region, like especially like young Russians, young Belarusians, and young Ukrainians, we are going, so there is no hope, like our political system supposed to be authoritarian, because this is the only way how they are talking about it. My solution is also about, when we're talking about, this has created the needs of grassroots mobilizations, like inside and outside. I think in a situation like in Belarus, we need to support our diaspora for its efforts for global mobilization. I think we need to support youth and youth projects. I think this is like one of the people who will change our country and our region eventually. We need to support this new wave of media who can, you know, go out, who could penetrate in country, who could penetrate in this informational bubble via TikTok, Instagram, and like creating this fear, and then suddenly somehow started to transfer it to some mobilization, into some democratic actions. So yeah, so basically this is a 3 main points what I wanted to highlight, and yeah, pass it on you.
Thanks so much, Nick. I think you're tapping into a conversation that I was really hoping that we will have later. So very briefly around the needs of the organizing is that diasporic organizing is something that very rarely supported by the funders in particularly, and there is always an assumption that whatever resistance and organizing will always come from within. So I think it's really important point that you're bringing up. And I apologize to you that you're just now learning that diaspora is becoming depoliticized once it's leaving. So we can talk about it separately because I'm Armenian diaspora and it's not only depoliticized, but it's much more conservative than it was when it was inside. So I think that's another trend that is happening for a lot of diasporic people, especially the traumatized diasporic people. Tamta, quickly to you, Georgia has had so much impact after the war in Ukraine in different ways, and some of them you already mentioned. Maybe a couple of more points from your side of the important pieces that you want to share that the impact of the invasion of Ukraine had on Georgia in just a couple of minutes, please.
Yeah. So first of all, of course, this will heavily impact on our people, yeah, because all these events somehow haunted by all the war traumas and re-traumatization was very visible in our people, our IDPs, people who are living across the occupation line. They feel that their traumas and fears now are in place, and they were very, very shocked after this war. And we see high solidarity towards Ukraine in our society. In the first days of the beginning of the war, the streets of Tbilisi were full of the Protestants who expressed solidarity with the Ukrainian people and asked the Georgian government to support Ukraine more effectively. However, at that time and even now, the Georgian government started to distinguish himself from the Ukraine. And very often, moreover, they are very often talking about the mistakes of Ukraine that they could not avoid the war. Yeah, and this anti-Ukraine sentiment, it's about the government of Ukraine, not Ukrainian people, is very, very strong in their rhetoric. And as I mentioned, after these events, we see how suddenly Georgian foreign policy changed, and the Georgian government and like the Russia and consequently the Georgian government, they started, they opened the flights with the Moscow and Tbilisi and in other regions as well. The Georgians' dependency on the market of Russia increased, and a lot of Russian migrants entered in Georgia. Some of them, like the dissidents, activists, yeah, very important people who are struggling with the Kremlin and Putinist regime, but also the hundreds of people, and this wave of migration somehow influenced on our social and economic environment as well. But what was especially interesting for me, we see how the Georgian government started the instrumentalization of different fears and war-related fears, especially after this period. Yeah, they started this campaign that someone within the country and in the West are interested to like the intervene Georgia into the war, and that they are the only power, that like the only political force who is trying to avoid this. Yeah. Yeah, after these events, we see that this hyper-majoritarian logic, which was like the usual for Georgian political system, that we have one ruling political party with a lot of powers, it becomes like it's widened and widened. Yeah, and government is now even trying to control the independent institutions, filmmakers, cultural centers, etc. And also it's very interesting how they are trying to use the social vulnerability which exists in our society. I mentioned that Georgia is quite a poor country. About 700,000 people are dependent on the monthly social assistance coming from the state. We have like the 300,000 civil servants, and we see how the political system is aggressively controlling them and their freedom of expression and everything. So we see these paternalistic logics and social support mechanisms are effectively instrumentalized by the government to control our own citizens. Yeah. And all these tendencies, which were some more or less visible in the past, now it's accelerated, like the stronger. And of course, the situation when we had quite low trust towards the political elites, including because of the traumas related to the former government and political parties related to that government, we see that our people are like the confused. We are thinking a lot what can be the theory of change for us, how to somehow guarantee our safety and security and threats coming from the Russia, but how to continue democratization of this country. And how the progressive groups in our country and maybe in the region and Tbilisi become really the place of different activists, yeah, including the activists from Russia, Belarus, Azerbaijani. So they are here. We are trying to build some networks with them and to think more what can we do together to struggle with these powers and very authoritarian and repressive logics we see in our politics.
Thanks so much, Champa. It's super helpful context. And yeah, I think that that's definitely something that we see across all of the regions within the region, that one of the impact we saw coming into Georgia is that so many people moved from different diasporas to now be located in Georgia to operate. And it's also becoming harder because Georgia is currently, cracking down on with a lot of oppressive laws. So what that would look like also is something for us to keep tracking and looking. If we don't have a haven of Tbilisi for a lot of organizers to stay in, what does that mean for some of it? I want to go to you, Nurjan, very quickly to talk about the impact of Ukraine. If one looks at the map of that part of the world, Kyrgyzstan is so far away from Ukraine. And I have myself taken a flight from Kyiv to Bishkek. It's almost 6 hours of flying. How possibly did the war in Ukraine impact Kyrgyzstan and wider Central Asia, if you may?
Thank you. First of all, I want to highlight that I also want to make the division on the government of Kyrgyzstan and also civil society and also wider public, because the war in Ukraine has made a lot of public discussion and division within the wider public, and also making this opposing, sides, let's say, because of the huge manipulation and brainwashing. You might know or not, but we have Russian channels being broadcasted 24/7 for our own tax money, by the way. And according to researchers, wider public watches still TV, relies or even uses TV news as fact-checking for what comes from the internet. So that's why we have this different opinion and not wider, let's say, support to Ukraine, but civil society members have been showing solidarity and conducting, solidarity protests in front of Ukrainian embassy, and some activists were fined and detained and fined for that. If we speak about broader picture, I can say that the war has only catalyzed all the acceptance, adoption, all of the restrictive laws in Kyrgyzstan, like foreign agent law, also law that restricts the access and restricts the rights on the education related to sexual and health education. And also because, for example, if you speak about foreign agent law, it was introduced very first time in 2013, and Kyrgyzstan civil society has been able to resist it for 10 years. But then, without any discussion, it was just adopted. It means that Kyrgyzstan has faced huge pressure from Russia, and also like Russia now being isolated, it more than ever relies on Central Asian, let's say, ally governments, and uses as backup to avoid sanctions and to show the world that it still has some allies. And it also uses labor and other, like steel resources, as it has been before during the Soviet time. Another thing is that I think Russia now, even though it's within like this full war in Ukraine, it still has the ability to control our region. And for example, the border conflict that happened between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, it's a frozen conflict, but it really influenced the security situation. And then this again, the arguments, of Russia being only ally who control this region, and also, like who provides security for this region. And I can also say about and regarding the activists of being like leaving Russia and coming to Central Asia, like we had the first of all, huge amount of people who came, who were like avoided war and being, like recruited for war, like specifically men. And also another flow is activists also. And we can see there were flow of activists from North Asia and indigenous republics, indigenous communities who feel more or less safe in Central Asian countries. There are some united collaboration like projects with local activists, mainly on decolonization and narrative change and voicing our perspectives, let's say, like diverse perspectives. But on the other side, it's not safe for activists to be in our countries. There were cases of activists being deported by requests of Russian government. So we need, it's not safe to like publicly, for example, to publicly announce information about like opposing the war in Ukraine or opposing Russian politics, then you would be deported by Kyrgyz government. And if I very short, also like briefly speak about what are the needs currently, is that one of the reasons as how situation has like very fast deteriorated in Kyrgyzstan from becoming island of democracy to like fully authoritarian regime, is that civil society has been burnt out because it has been in on mode all the time crisis, and like heavily underfunded, or funders have been very harming, like with all of this burdened requests, let's say, and not understanding the context of Central Asia, not understanding the context of Kyrgyzstan. So, and regarding the needs, is that providing very flexible support to the local organizers, to communities, and truly listen to the early warning signals, early warning signs that are civil society activists and groups that are sending and being very loud about it, thanks to social media, thanks to the networks. And another thing is that we had the conversation with, it's just an example of also how some funders left Central Asia because of this, because of the sanctions list and because of Central Asian governments. So they're like officially they're actually neutral, right? But non-officially supporting and backupping Russia. And some funders left Central Asia and stopped funding community level work activists, which also like heavily influenced. So I think it's really important to distinguish that there is a government politics and then there is a still civil society and resistance from people, which should be acknowledged and listened and taken into consideration in order to support and first of all understand the region and particularly each country of this region. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jean. Appreciate it. And I appreciate you already starting to build up into what are the needs of the activists and the kind of requests for the funders. So I want to go to you, Anastasia, to give us a little bit briefly around the impact of the war on Moldova. As we know, it has been on the receiving end of a lot of people who've been leaving from Ukraine immediately and had a huge impact economically and politically, of course, on the country, and also kind of transition us into what is your request for the funders now, 2 years after the Ukraine invasion, and so many things that we have contextualized for them as some of them are getting together for some conferences that will be taking place in our regions. So also I invite you to give us that, and then we will close with the rest of the folks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angelika. So yeah, of course, Moldova is a neighbor country. And when the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine started, we felt it immediately, same day, and not only because a huge wave of refugees came into Moldova. And of course, it influenced us dramatically, especially from economical and a social point of view. But also because, as you know, in Moldova, we have a frozen conflict in Transnistrian region, and we already have Russian troops in the country. And of course, the risk that war will come to us immediately, it was very, very high, especially in the very beginning. And at that time, people, even within civil society, we didn't know what to do to provide help to those who came for Ukraine or to run ourselves from Moldova to a safer space. And it was very, very hard because emotionally for us it was really hard to take a decision to stay and to be a safe space for others when we are not sure at all that it is a safe space. So we created shelters especially for the most vulnerable groups, lesbian couples, trans people, non-binary persons from Ukraine who came to Moldova. But at the same time, all of us, we do understand that Moldova is not the most friendly LGBT country. And of course, people just spend some time in Moldova and then they went further to Western Europe to be more safe and more protected. But I think till now, Moldova is under risk, and we can hear it. From time to time, Russian government, they mention Moldova, they mention Moldova's situation. They are not happy at all about what the current government is doing in terms of foreign policy of the country. So I think this risk is still here. And we used to live with this, but at the same time, it's on the background all the time. And this instability influence all our work. But at the same time, of course, we continue to do what we are doing and what we used to do when the war just started. From economical point of view, in the beginning, it was huge crisis, but now I think more or less it became more stable now. And also it influenced opinion of society as well, because on the one hand, it united people. And for people in Moldova, they really liked to call themselves like a small country with a big heart. But at the same time, some political forces, they use it to divide people as well. To say, you see, Ukrainians came to take our resources, and we are in a bad economical situation because of refugees, etc. So it was a lot of manipulation again. And in this situation, I think it's really important, and that time we also highlighted it many, many times, that it's very important for donors who came to Moldova to support our work with refugees. And it was super needed, and it was very, very important and very useful, but also to support local communities as well. Because sometimes we were in situation when we've been able to provide some kind of support, for example, hormonal therapy for trans people from Ukraine, but not for Moldovans. And of course, this inequality can influence relationships between, like, inside community itself. So that's why I think one of the messages for donors who come to countries in crisis situations, to keep this balance and to distribute resources fair. And it's not only about this particular situation, but in general, even within community itself, when we see what are huge amounts of money are distributed to HIV/AIDS prevention for gay men, for example, and lack of resources for lesbian organizations or trans organizations. It's like we really need to pay attention on fair distribution of resources and to support all parts of communities, and also those who are most vulnerable, those who do not have resources, and taking into account intersectional perspective, because being a part of LGBT community, but also being a woman, being a Roma person, being a person with disabilities, it's really increase the level of vulnerability, and donors need to take it into account and to support those who are most vulnerable and who need this money, first of all. Because now in Moldova, for example, we do not have any lesbian organization. Why? Because it's almost impossible to survive for lesbian organization not to be part of LGBT movement. And of course, in this situation, it's really, really important for us to build solidarity within community itself, but also to answer specific needs of specific communities and to provide them resources for that, including financial resources. And I completely relate to what Nurjan said about supporting local initiatives, and trust us. We are here, we are local people, we know what is important and what is possible and not possible in our countries, because sometimes donors try to say us, okay, here is strategic plan we think would be better for you. But we work for years in our regions, and we know better what strategies are the best for community members, and we are in constant contact with communities. And even if donors believe that something would work in our countries, maybe it's not. And I think one of my main message to donors would be to trust local communities, to support all parts of community, and to provide fair distribution of resources, and also to listen to us, and to provide flexible funding, and to provide long-term funding, because sometimes it's just not possible to achieve social changes when you have one-year project and you're not able to continue it because lack of funding. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anastasia. Really appreciate it. It's like a playbook for the funders to kind of have a checklist of things that you have offered. This is super helpful. I want to say apologies that Nick had to leave because we are running a bit out of time. And so he had to step out at this point, but thank you for his contribution as well to this conversation. Tamda, do you want to add anything to the list that Anastasia started for the, asks of the funders and the expression of the needs and requests for them?
Thanks to my colleagues. Your observations are somehow very similar, we have, but I would like to add some general points. Yeah, first of all, I would like to mention that in Georgian context, and maybe it's somehow common for you as well, the civil society organizations, civil society itself, was constructed from the top-down perspective. We are calling this process as the NGOization, yeah? So when the civil society organizations were established under the support of the donor organization, and only now we are observing the process when we have like the unfunded, unsupported self-organization of the people within the social movement, within the activist groups, etc. So usually, historically, in a democratic countries, we have the bottom-up perspective, yeah, when there is the social movements, mobilization of the people who are demanding the common issues, some reflecting their grievances, and then they are institutionalizing their interests and their demands. Yeah, in our case, we had the first these NGOs, and then only now we are observing that civil society is becoming stronger and stronger, and different people from the communities they are engaged in the social changes. And this logic of construction of civil society in our country deepened depend first of all local CSO's agenda on the donors' priorities, and sometimes we see that even the donors, like the dominant donor organizations and dominant, like the mainstream NGOs, they are not reflecting the real interest and the grievances our people have. Yeah, I mentioned the problem of development projects and the development programs in Georgia, and I can describe them mostly as a neoliberal projects. Yeah, as they are interested to have the good justice systems, transparent institutions, etc. Yeah, but they are not oriented on the welfare-related issue, social security-related issue, on the issues to protect the social rights, etc. And now we see that Georgia is very poor and economically inequal country, and the real interest of the majority of the society are not reflected in the agenda of the NGOs or even the donor organizations. Yeah. And somehow why we have like this widespread understanding that NGOs are not reflecting the interests of the majority, yeah, is that we are not effectively talking, working, and struggling for the social and economical injustices. That's why, from my perspective, it's very, very important, not only for the just politics, but also for the rebuilding of the trust towards the NGOs, to have the modern organizations who are oriented on the social, economic, environmental injustices. Yeah, it's very, very crucial for me. The second concept I would like to share with you is that the NGOs in our country is used to use like that. Usually we are trying to build international advocacy. So how the usually NGOs are working? Yeah, so they are using formal, local, and international mechanisms to arise important issues before the Brussels, before the Washington, and other actors in the global north to influence the government. Yep. But now we see, due to these shifts and changes within the foreign policy, that our government is not following the recommendations and calls coming from the Brussels, yeah? And now we see that we are somehow, how to say, paralyzed, yeah? We don't know how to influence on the government because we have less experience how to build democratic networks, build force within our society, and to build solidarity networks, yeah? And that's why it's very important for the donor organizations to support not like this traditional advocacy work to provide some reforms via the support of international organizations and international commitment Georgia has, but how to build the force, trust, and networks within the society, how to create the democratic platforms for the social changes, yeah? And it means that donor organization should think more about the social movements, activist groups, decentralized networks. Unfortunately, now we see that donor organizations are mostly interested to support like the bigger, well-organized, well-managed organization, and not like these small mobilizations we have in the regions and in the towns, yeah. And the last point is about the flexibility, yeah. We see how NGOs become very professionalized, managerialized, yeah, because you have to struggle with this huge bureaucracy demanded by the donors. And we see also that the reality is changing frequently, and sometimes when you are writing or like elaborating design and objectives of your project, it's changed, like the reality is changing and you have to adopt, and very often it's very difficult to properly negotiate with the donors, yeah. So we need more flexible support to be adequate to the change reality, not to be so bureaucratical and managerialized, and to be politically adequate as well. And of course, when I'm talking about the flexibility, it's very important to care about us as a communities, as a organizations, yeah, because now the security of organizations, security of the members of these organizations or movements is very, very crucial. And we need institutional development as well to be safer and to be sustainable. And this part of support is also very, very important for us. Yeah, so it's about the priority, about the strategy, and about the institutional development and flexibility, which is highly important in our context.
Thank you so much, Tanta, for this. And to all of you, I would like to wrap it up here, and it will absolutely give injustice to this conversation if I try to summarize anything from it. So I just hope whoever is listening to this webinar is taking what's useful and able to piece together a very complex story. And as I said in the very beginning, to use this as part of the learning journey about the region. So this is kind of a warm-up introduction to a lot of things that are happening. And I'm so grateful to each of you for your voices, for making this happen. Thank you all so much, and take care.